New Orleans, a city renowned for its eerie tales and mysteries, always seemed to be cloaked in a foreboding atmosphere as night fell. Far from the bustling city center, hidden deep within the desolate outskirts, lay Silver Creek Cemetery, casting a dark shadow over the town. No one knew exactly when Silver Creek had been established, but terrifying stories about it had been passed down through generations. This was no ordinary cemetery. For a long time, Silver Creek had been known as the resting place for souls who could never find peace, those condemned for witchcraft, wrongfully executed, and guilty of other heinous crimes. Locals whispered that by night, this place was not just a cemetery, but a gateway to the other side, where restless spirits of the wrongfully dead roamed, seeking release but never finding it. The night had grown late, with faint moonlight casting shadows over rows of tombstones, now covered in moss and overgrown with weeds. A cold wind blew in gusts, carrying with it sounds that resembled distant sighs and unintelligible murmurs, echoing through the silent darkness. The barren branches of ancient trees stretched out like skeletal hands, ready to grasp anyone daring enough to set foot inside. Though the cemetery had been abandoned for a long time, no one dared venture into Silver Creek at night, for they feared what lurked deep within the thick fog, waiting. In an old bar on the outskirts of the city, 3 young men sat huddled together in a dark corner, the air around them heavy with tension. Daniel, a 28-year-old man with a rugged, weathered look, was always considered the strongest and most decisive in the group, but now his face revealed a clear strain. Beside him sat Ryan, 27, the risk-taker of the group, often the one to push for their bold decisions. Lastly, there was Alex, only 26, usually the calm and rational one, yet even he couldn't hide his growing unease. They had sunk deep into massive gambling debts, and none of them had any way to pay it off. Daniel owed $50,000, Ryan nearly $30,000, and Alex wasn't far behind, with a debt of $20,000. The sums were so large that they knew if they didn't find a solution in the next few days, their lives would fall into the hands of ruthless loan sharks. The atmosphere in the bar was dark and stifling. The clinking of glasses blended with the murmurs of other patrons. Ryan, with his hot-headed nature, slammed his glass down on the table, his voice full of frustration. "We can't just sit here and wait to die. There has to be a way out of this mess." Daniel frowned, staring down at the drink in front of him, but said nothing. He knew Ryan was right, but he couldn't think of any solution that would fix their situation. Alex remained silent, his eyes distant, as if searching for an escape that seemed increasingly impossible. At that moment, a raspy voice came from behind them. "Hey, I heard you boys talking about debt. Care to hear a story?" All 3 turned around to see an old man standing next to their table. He was small and hunched, his face deeply lined with wrinkles, and his cloudy eyes gleamed with an unsettling brightness. Despite his age, there was something mysterious about him that made it hard for the group to look away. Ryan, always the risk-taker, and easily swayed by temptation, raised an eyebrow and asked, "What kind of story? If it's not about making money, don't waste our time." The old man chuckled softly, then pulled up a chair and sat down, lowering his voice with an air of intrigue. "Not far from here, there's a place called Silver Creek Cemetery. Inside, there's a very special grave of Margaret Devereux, a dark witch executed over a century ago. They say Margaret performed sinister rituals, making pacts with demons, sacrificing the living in exchange for the power of immortality. Even though she's long dead, Her body remains perfectly preserved. And the most interesting part is, the old man paused, as if weighing whether he should continue, then leaned in closer to the three young men and whispered, "Researchers are willing to pay a fortune to get their hands on her body. This could be your chance to wipe out those debts." The old man's words echoed in their minds like a glimmer of hope amidst the suffocating despair. Ryan was the first to leap to his feet, his eyes gleaming with greed. "We just need to dig up the grave and sell her body, right?" Daniel and Alex stared at Ryan in shock, but the bold idea flickered in their own eyes too. They knew grave robbing was dangerous and could lead to unimaginable consequences. Yet, the promise of the enormous sum of money the old man mentioned clouded their judgment. "All right," Daniel said, after carefully considering it. "We'll do it. Tomorrow night, we'll go to Silver Creek Cemetery." With that decision, they had unknowingly stepped into a dark nightmare, where Margaret Devereux awaited her chance to return and seek her revenge. Night had fallen, and a thick fog enveloped every corner of Silver Creek Cemetery. The lone moonlight above wasn't enough to chase away the eerie shadows. Instead, it made the surroundings colder and more haunting. The wind blew through the moss-covered graves, producing chilling sounds like whispers from the other side. Daniel, Ryan, and Alex stood at the cemetery gates, their hearts pounding with tension and anxiety. They had brought flashlights, shovels, and the tools needed to unearth the grave of Margaret Devereux. Though they knew this was a reckless act, the enormous debts weighing on their shoulders left them no other choice. "Let's just get this done quickly and get out of here," Ryan muttered, trying to mask the nervousness in his voice. Despite being the most daring of the group, the deathly silence around them made him uneasy. Alex, the calmest of the trio, gave a slight nod, while Daniel remained silent, his eyes fixed on the dark void ahead. They stepped through the old iron gate, the rusty bars creaking as if warning them of what lay ahead. Each step echoed in the still air, the sound bouncing off the crumbling tombstones, creating the unsettling sensation that they were being watched. A chilling cold seeped into their skin, not just from the night breeze, but from the oppressive atmosphere of the cemetery itself. "They say Margaret was executed here," Daniel spoke, trying to break the eerie silence. "She devoted her life to dark magic. People believe her soul still lingers here, never finding peace." "They say Margaret was executed here," Daniel spoke, trying to break the eerie silence. "She devoted her life to dark magic. People believe her soul still lingers here, never finding peace." Ryan chuckled, but the sound was strained, unnatural. A restless soul. Just ghost stories to scare kids. Even as he dismissed it, Ryan couldn't shake the creeping sense of unease building in his mind. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, it seemed as though faint shadows were moving behind them, flitting between the trees and gravestones. It could have been the play of their flashlights, but then again, maybe not. The three continued deeper into the cemetery until they finally found Margaret Devereux's grave, an ancient tomb set apart from the others, much larger than the surrounding graves. The tombstone was inscribed with strange, ancient symbols, worn down by time but still exuding an ominous presence. Alex knelt down to read the inscriptions, but quickly realized he couldn't make sense of the language. "That's strange," Alex murmured. "We should hurry up." Daniel nodded, gripping the shovel tightly. They began digging, each forceful strike of the shovel into the ground seeming to disturb the dark forces lying beneath. With every shovelful of dirt unearthed, the atmosphere grew heavier. The wind turned colder, swirling around them like an invisible hand, tugging them closer to the earth, as if something unseen was pulling them down into the grave. As they dug deeper, the air around them grew stifling and more terrifying. A strange, foul odor began to rise from the earth, forcing them to hold their breath for a moment. But the most disturbing thing was the mysterious sounds that started to echo around them, like whispers coming from right beside their ears. "Did you hear that?" Ryan stopped, his face showing clear signs of anxiety. I think someone's watching us." Daniel and Alex paused, listening closely. Indeed, amidst the cemetery's eerie silence, faint murmurs could be heard like the whispers of forgotten souls. The voices were unclear, but just enough to send shivers down their spines. Ryan quickly turned on his flashlight, sweeping it across the graveyard, but there was nothing there, only darkness. "Maybe it's just the wind," Daniel said, trying to reassure the group, though deep down, he wasn't so sure. At last, after what felt like an eternity, they uncovered Margaret's coffin. It was an old, black, wooden coffin, etched with deep, dark symbols of witchcraft. None of them dared to voice it, but all three sensed they had stumbled upon something far beyond their control. When Daniel placed his hand on the coffin lid, a chilling sensation crept up his spine, sending a cold shiver through his body. "We have to open it," Alex said, though his voice trembled. Even the calmest of the group could no longer hide the fear gripping him. With great reluctance, Daniel pushed against the coffin lid. A creaking sound echoed as the rotting wood strained against his effort. Slowly, the lid opened, and as it fully lifted, the beam of their flashlights illuminated the horrifying sight inside. Margaret Devereux's body was not a decayed corpse. Instead, her flesh remained intact, pale and cold. Her eyes were closed, and her deathly pale face, distorted in an eerie way, appeared as though she were merely sleeping. But the most shocking thing, what left the three men frozen in disbelief, was the faint sound of breathing escaping her lips. Daniel stumbled back, his heart racing wildly. "What the hell? Is she still alive?" "It can't be," Ryan muttered, his hands starting to tremble. She's dead. There's no way she's still alive." But as they voiced their denials, the atmosphere around them began to shift. The wind picked up, howling through the cemetery, and the mysterious whispers grew louder, clearer, as if the very air around them was alive. The shadows in the night thickened, swirling like dark figures encircling them, waiting for something terrible to unfold. The darkness of Silver Creek Cemetery seemed to awaken, swallowing the three men whole. And then, from within the shadows, a soft, chilling giggle echoed a woman's laugh, haunting and drawn out, reverberating through the night, sending a cold wave of fear deep into their bones. The wind howled even stronger, swirling around the grave like a ghostly vortex, making the already suffocating air nearly unbearable. Daniel, Ryan, and Alex stood frozen in place before Margaret Devereux's coffin. They couldn't tear their eyes away from her Badia corpse, disturbingly preserved, yet radiating something far from peaceful. Margaret's pale lips seemed to quiver as if she were breathing, even though her body had been buried for centuries. Ryan, usually the most reckless of the group, tried to steady himself. He swallowed hard, his eyes still fixed on the corpse. "We need to take this body and get out of here, before something terrible happens." Daniel, still shaken, glanced at Ryan and Alex. He nodded, though a rising fear clawed at him from within. The three of them began preparing to lift Margaret's body out of the coffin. But the moment their hands touched her cold flesh, a strange sound echoed not from the cemetery, but from beneath the earth itself. It was a low moaning, like the wails of thousands of trapped souls lamenting from the depths below. Suddenly, a fierce gust of wind swept through, extinguishing all their flashlights. Thick darkness enveloped them, leaving only the faint moonlight to cast eerie shadows on the ground. The giggling they had heard earlier now echoed more clearly, as if mocking them. Ryan fumbled with his flashlight, his hands trembling in fear, and as the beam flickered back on, they caught glimpses of shadowy figures gliding between the rows of graves. "What the hell is happening?" Alex whispered, his voice trembling with anxiety. He felt as though hundreds of invisible eyes were watching them, as if the entire cemetery had come to life. Even Daniel, usually the calmest of them, couldn't hide his growing panic. "We need to get out of here, right now. This isn't just a grave. Something is terribly wrong here." The three quickly gathered their tools, but when they tried to move Margaret's body, an invisible force held it in place. Alex tugged hard, but Margaret's body wouldn't budge, as if it were anchored to the coffin by some supernatural power. At that very moment, a deep, agonizing moan rose from beneath the earth, drawn out and horrifying. Ryan, panicking, spun around to face Daniel and Alex. "We can't take her. We need to leave now, before something comes." As soon as the words left his mouth, the ground beneath them began to tremble softly, as though something from below was trying to rise. The shadowy figures moving between the graves were no longer illusions. They were clear, now human-like shapes, cursed souls trapped within Silver Creek, all slowly advancing toward the three of them. Each step they took toward the trio brought a chill that wrapped around them like a deathly grip. The cursed souls had awoken, and they were closing in. The three bolted away from the grave, leaving Margaret's unmoving body behind. But the most terrifying thing was the sound, the unmistakable sound of her breathing growing louder, longer and icily clear, as though she had begun to wake. The three bolted away from the grave, leaving Margaret's unmoving body behind. But the most terrifying thing was the sound, the unmistakable sound of her breathing growing louder, longer and icily clear, as though she had begun to wake. Their heavy, panicked breaths mingled with the wind, as the agonizing moans of tormented souls grew louder, more distinct. Daniel led the way, desperately searching for a way out, but the space around them seemed to twist and distort. The shadows followed closely, closing in from every direction. Alex stumbled, feeling as if his legs were weighed down by an unseen force pulling him into the ground. Even Ryan, usually so confident and reckless, was now gasping for air, his eyes wide with terror as he sensed something looming just behind them. Each step became a race against the inevitable, the cursed souls of Silver Creek drawing closer. "We're lost!" Ryan shouted, his voice trembling. "This cemetery, it's not just a place anymore. It's alive." The moment Ryan's words left his mouth, a chilling, sinister laugh echoed from behind them. All three turned, only to see a faint figure materializing through the fog. It was Margaret, at least a haunting image of her standing amidst the gravestones, her milky white eyes burning with hatred. She smiled, a twisted, grotesque grin, like a predator toying with its prey. Daniel tried to avert his gaze, but his eyes were locked onto the terrifying sight. It felt as if his body was frozen in place, unable to move. Margaret's breath, long and cold, reverberated in the air, filling the space with an unsettling chill. She didn't advance toward them, but simply stood there, her sharp gaze holding them captive, preventing their escape. The air around them thickened with dread, as if the very cemetery had come to life through her will. "Run!" Alex shouted, yanking Ryan and Daniel forward. They sprinted, but every step seemed to drag them deeper into an endless darkness. Margaret's ghostly figure glided behind them effortlessly, as if playing a twisted game of cat and mouse. They ran without stopping, knowing full well there was nowhere to truly escape. Finally, they reached the cemetery gates, bursting through, gasping for air, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had survived the night, but all three knew they had awoken something far more terrifying than they could ever have imagined. Margaret's spirit was no mere restless. Celit was a powerful, vengeful entity, and she had been aroused from her eternal slumber. After leaving Silver Creek Cemetery, Daniel, Ryan, and Alex felt as if they had narrowly escaped a horrifying nightmare. But the relief didn't last long. Each of them began experiencing strange occurrences, and they quickly realized that the terror was still clinging to them, even after they had left that haunted place behind. Daniel was the first to sense that something was wrong. The night after they left Silver Creek, he started having strange dreams. In his dreams, he stood alone in the cemetery, the wind howling around him, and shadowy figures drifting past his sight. When he looked down at his feet, he found himself standing before Margaret Devereux's grave. And there she was, staring at him with those milky white eyes full of hatred. Each night, the dream grew more vivid, as though Daniel was no longer just an observer, but truly trapped in that terrifying place. The feeling of being watched, of being pursued, gnawed at him day and night. He couldn't shake the sense that Margaret's curse had followed him out of the cemetery and into his waking life. Ryan began hearing whispers. At first, he thought it was just his nerves frayed from the events at the cemetery, but the whispers grew louder and more persistent. Whenever he was alone, whether in his home or walking down the street, the voices echoed in his mind, as though someone or something was calling his name from afar. Worse still, he felt a constant, invisible gaze watching him, a terrifying presence, as if something had followed him from Silver Creek and refused to let him go. Alex, however, suffered the most. Shortly after leaving the cemetery, strange marks began to appear on his body. At first, there were minor scratches on his arms and legs, barely noticeable, but they gradually deepened, becoming more painful. Alex couldn't recall how or when he'd been injured, but each morning, he awoke to find new wounds. It felt as though something unseen was attacking him in his sleep, clawing at his flesh every night. The growing sense of dread consumed him, as if whatever haunted Silver Creek had latched onto him and was slowly tearing him apart. Though none of the three dared to say it aloud, they all understood deep down that something terrible had followed them home from Silver Creek. They had made an unforgivable mistake by disturbing Margaret Devereux's grave, and now her cursed spirit was haunting them, waiting for the right moment to exact her revenge. Though none of the three dared to say it aloud, they all understood deep down that something terrible had followed them home from Silver Creek. They had made an unforgivable mistake by disturbing Margaret Devereux's grave, and now her cursed spirit was haunting them, waiting for the right moment to exact her revenge. Unable to endure it any longer, Daniel decided to call Ryan and Alex for a meeting. They gathered at the same bar where they had first heard the story of the cemetery from the mysterious old man. This time, however, there was no alcohol or laughter, only a tense, oppressive silence filled with worry and fear. "I can't sleep," Daniel confessed, his voice hoarse. "Every night, I dream of her. Margaret, she's watching us. I feel like I can't escape it." His words hung heavy in the air, echoing the fear that all three shared but had been too afraid to admit. They had unleashed something beyond their understanding, and now it was closing in. Ryan nodded, his eyes dark and sunken from sleepless nights. I hear the whispers too. Everywhere, all the time. It's like someone's calling my name. Alex, who had been the quietest of the group, finally spoke up, his voice trembling. I've been scratched by something I can't see. I think we brought her curse back with us. The three of them sat in silence for a few moments, none of them sure what to say or do. Finally, Ryan slammed his fist down on the table, causing his glass to shake. We have to do something. We can't just sit here and wait to die. Daniel sighed heavily, looking directly at his two friends. I think we need to find someone who can help. A priest, an exorcist, or someone who understands curses. Alex nodded hesitantly, fear evident in his eyes. Maybe we need to go back to Silver Creek. If there's a way to break this curse, it has to be there. But I'm scared of what we'll find. None of them wanted to return to Silver Creek Cemetery, but they knew it was the only way to free themselves from this nightmare. Margaret Devereux had awakened, and now they had to face her once more, whether they were ready or not. The following days passed in a haze of panic and dread. Daniel, Ryan, and Alex quickly realized there was no escaping the curse they had unwittingly unleashed. When they disturbed Margaret Devereux's grave, the strange occurrences worsened, and now their lives had become a never-ending nightmare with no way out. Ryan, who had always been the fearless one, now found himself trapped by the relentless whispers that haunted him. At first, the sounds were faint, like distant murmurs beside his ear, but they grew louder, clearer, as if the spirits were standing right next to him, speaking to him. Whenever he was alone, the whispers became frenzied, calling his name incessantly, urging him to do terrible things. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Ryan awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. He looked around, but his bedroom was empty. Then, he began to hear heavy footsteps echoing from outside his room. He opened the door, but no one was there. The whispers, once soft, had transformed into furious screams. They were no longer quiet sounds, they were voices filled with anger, demanding and accusing him, shouting in rage. Ryan stood frozen in the hallway, the air thick with the presence of something unseen, yet undeniably close. The curse had tightened its grip, and Ryan knew that what once seemed like a nightmare had become all too real. You have disturbed our eternal rest. You will pay the price. Ryan collapsed to the floor, clutching his head, screaming in agony, but the voices didn't relent. He felt invisible hands pulling him toward the darkness, dragging him away from reality. For a moment, he thought he was about to lose his mind. Then, suddenly, everything fell silent and deathly. Oppressive stillness filled the room. Ryan's eyes widened as he sensed an overwhelming presence behind him. Slowly, he turned, and there, standing quietly in the shadows, was the ghostly figure of Margaret Devereux. Her pale face and white, soulless eyes stared back at him. No words were needed, her gaze alone made it clear. Margaret didn't just seek revenge. She wanted to drag them all down to hell with her. Ryan's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in terror as he realized the full extent of what they had awakened. Margaret's curse was far from over. It had only just begun. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Daniel was desperately seeking help. He had called old friends, trying to find anyone who might have knowledge of the spiritual world, but it was all in vain. As a last resort, Daniel decided to visit an exorcist he had heard about through an old acquaintance. This man, an elderly figure living on the outskirts of the city, had reportedly helped those haunted by dark forces before. With the faintest glimmer of hope, Daniel drove to the exorcist's home. The small house was hidden deep within a desolate forest, surrounded by dense trees. When Daniel knocked on the door, the old man answered, his face stern yet calm. His eyes seemed to pierce through Daniel, as if he instantly understood the gravity of the curse following him. "You've made a grave mistake," the old man said in a raspy but powerful voice. "You have awakened the spirit of someone who should never have been disturbed." Daniel nodded, trying to maintain composure as he recounted everything that had happened. When he reached the part about exhuming Margaret Devereux's grave, the old man shook his head, his eyes growing sharper, colder. "Margaret Devereux is not just any restless soul," the exorcist continued, his voice thick with warning. "Her spirit is one of vengeance, bound by a dark power that few can control. She will not stop until she drags you all into her eternal torment." Margaret Devereux was a powerful dark witch, the old man continued gravely. She was condemned and executed for the horrific crimes she'd committed. But even in death, her spirit remained imprisoned in that cemetery, never allowed to cross over. By disturbing her grave, you have broken the seal that protected this world from her. Daniel felt a cold shiver run through his body. Is there any way to break this curse? We can't keep living like this." The old man was silent for a moment, deep in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with caution. "The only way to stop Margaret's spirit from tormenting you is to seal her away once more. But it won't be easy. You must return to Silver Creek Cemetery and perform a ritual to close the gateway between her world and this one." Daniel's heart sank. The thought of returning to that cursed place filled him with dread, but he knew they had no choice. Daniel swallowed hard, uncertain if he could convince Ryan and Alex to return to that haunted place. But he knew deep down that if they didn't, all three of them would be dragged into death by Margaret's vengeful spirit. With the exorcist's instructions in hand, Daniel immediately sought out Ryan and Alex. When they gathered, it was clear to all of them that there was no more time for hesitation. Margaret's curse was growing stronger, and if they didn't act soon, they would be consumed by the darkness forever. Ryan, his face pale and weary from the relentless whispers, gave a reluctant nod. "We have to end this, or we're done for." Alex, still bearing the mysterious scratches on his arms, looked more terrified than ever, but there was a resolve in his eyes. "If this is the only way, then we have no choice." Determined, but terrified. The three of them knew the next step was to face the horror they had unleashed once more back at Silver Creek Cemetery. Night had fallen as Daniel, Ryan, and Alex made the perilous decision to return to Silver Creek Cemetery. This time, there were no illusions of treasure or a quick fix for their enormous debts. Instead, they were fighting for their survival. They had heeded the exorcist's warnings and knew there was only one way to escape. Margaret Devereux's curse, to seal her spirit away once more. The three of them packed the items the exorcist had given them: candles, talismans, and an ancient, tattered book containing old incantations. Yet none of these items could calm the growing fear inside them. The closer they got to Silver Creek, the more the oppressive sense of dread wrapped around them like an invisible noose. Daniel's car turned onto the narrow road leading to the cemetery. The atmosphere was unnervingly silent, with only the headlights cutting through the desolate path, occasionally catching the twisted shadows of barren trees. Ryan, sitting in the back seat, clutched the old book the exorcist had given them, his eyes never leaving the window, where the thick darkness seemed poised to swallow them whole. Alex, who had become increasingly anxious after suffering the mysterious scratches, muttered prayers under his breath, hoping for some kind of protection. As the cemetery loomed closer, they knew this was no ordinary journey. They were heading into the heart of darkness, where Margaret Devereux awaited, more powerful and vengeful than ever before. It will end after tonight, Daniel tried to reassure himself, though even he wasn't convinced. As they approached the gates of Silver Creek Cemetery, the air thickened with an eerie coldness, heavy and oppressive. The rows of tombstones stood motionless in the fog, and each step they took echoed unnervingly, as though something was listening. Fear crawled slowly through their bodies, gripping them with the inescapable sensation of a nightmare from which there was no escape. "You guys sure about this?" Alex asked, his voice trembling but filled with determination. Ryan nodded, his eyes betraying his anxiety but leaving no room for retreat. "We don't have a choice anymore." The three of them stood at the entrance of the cemetery, knowing that once they stepped inside, they would be confronting the full wrath of Margaret Devereux. With no other option, they prepared to face the horror that awaited within, hoping they had the strength and the time to seal her spirit before it was too late. They stepped cautiously into the cemetery, navigating through the moss-covered, crumbling tombstones. The sky had darkened further, with thick clouds obscuring the moon, leaving only the faint light of their candles to pierce the oppressive gloom. Darkness seemed to seep into every corner, surrounding the trio, heightening the sensation that they were being watched. As they approached Margaret Devereux's grave, Daniel felt a strange shift in the air. It wasn't just cold anymore. There was a menacing, supernatural energy, thick with hatred, pulsing through the ground. In the dim candlelight, Margaret's tombstone shimmered with ancient symbols, as if unseen eyes were watching their every move. "Hurry, we need to start the ritual," Ryan urged, his voice tense with urgency. His hands trembled as he opened the tattered book, his eyes scanning the difficult-to-read, ancient incantations. The energy surrounding them grew heavier with each passing second, as if Margaret's vengeful spirit could sense their presence, waiting for them to make their move. Alex and Daniel placed the candles around the grave as instructed by the exorcist. Each time a candle was lit, the surrounding darkness seemed to thicken, as if the supernatural forces were growing angrier with their presence. Distant whispers carried by the wind began to echo from all directions, like voices from the underworld, some weeping, others menacingly threatening. Ryan began chanting the spell aloud, but almost immediately, a powerful gust of wind surged through the cemetery, as if Margaret's fury had been awakened. The candles were snuffed out in an instant, plunging them back into darkness. An eerie chill swept over them, and from beneath the ground, the sounds of moaning and wailing grew louder, as though the trapped souls were rising, desperate to avoid being sealed away once more. "We have to keep going," Daniel shouted in panic, scrambling to relight the candles. "Don't stop, Ryan." Ryan's voice trembled, but he forced himself to continue reading from the ancient book, knowing that if they faltered now, Margaret's wrath would consume them all. Ryan gripped the book tightly, continuing to chant the spell despite the fierce wind pushing against him. Each word he uttered seemed to enrage Margaret's spirit further, as the ground beneath them trembled. From the earth, shadowy figures began to rise, no longer mere illusions, but twisted, grotesque forms of cursed souls, dragging themselves toward the trio. These shadows weren't just formless entities. They were the ones Margaret had imprisoned, now demanding retribution. Alex, panicking as the horrifying figures crept closer, took a step back, but he stumbled over a tombstone and fell to the ground. In an instant, an invisible hand clutched his leg, dragging him toward the earth. He screamed in terror, thrashing to free himself, but the supernatural force was too strong. He was being pulled into the darkness, deeper into the grip of something far beyond his control. "Help me," Alex cried out, his voice filled with desperation, but the power pulling him down was relentless. Ryan, seeing his friend in peril, faltered for a moment, his chant breaking, while Daniel rushed toward Alex, trying to grab hold of him. But the cursed spirits were closing in, and the grip of the grave was tightening. Daniel and Ryan could only watch in sheer terror as Alex was dragged into the darkness. "No," Daniel screamed, but deep down he knew there was nothing they could do to save him. The cursed souls had taken him. Ryan, with no time to mourn or panic, continued chanting louder, his voice rising in desperation. The final words of the spell rang out like a plea to the supernatural forces. Suddenly, a powerful burst of light erupted from the candles, illuminating the entire cemetery. That brilliant light tore through the oppressive darkness, scattering the twisted spirits and dispelling the shadowy figures. Margaret's spirit became more visible than ever, her form sharp and filled with wrath. Her pale, soulless eyes glared at them, burning with pure hatred. She let out a furious, blood-curdling scream and lunged at Daniel and Ryan with terrifying speed. But just as she was about to reach them, the light from the ritual surged even stronger, forming an invisible barrier between them and Margaret's vengeful spirit. The light pushed her back, her form writhing in agony as she struggled to break through. Margaret screeched in fury, her form starting to disintegrate as the power of the ritual overwhelmed her. She thrashed against the light, but it was too powerful. With one final, piercing scream, her spirit was torn apart, fading into the ether as the cemetery fell silent once more. The oppressive weight lifted from the air, and the spirits were gone. But as Daniel and Ryan stood there, breathing heavily, the loss of Alex weighed heavily on them. The curse had been broken, but the cost had been immense. Margaret's furious screams echoed through the cemetery as her ethereal body was slowly pulled back into the earth. The darkness that had suffocated the air began to lift, and soon everything fell into a heavy silence. The cold wind that had whipped around them moments ago suddenly ceased, and an eerie stillness settled over Silver Creek. Daniel and Ryan gasped for breath, drenched in sweat and trembling from the ordeal. They knew the ritual had worked, but the price had been devastating. Alex was dragged into the abyss by the cursed souls, and they knew they would never see him again. The loss weighed heavily on them, a grim reminder of the danger they had awakened. The two stood quietly before Margaret's grave, feeling the oppressive weight of the cemetery still lingering in the air. Though the immediate threat had passed, they could sense that the nightmare wasn't truly over, only subdued, waiting for another chance to rise again. After the brutal battle at Silver Creek Cemetery, Daniel and Ryan sat on the ground, gasping for breath, their bodies drenched in sweat and their minds utterly exhausted. The glow from the ritual's spell slowly faded, leaving only darkness and an oppressive silence hanging in the air. They had survived the nightmare, but before relief could fully settle in, a vague and creeping fear began to claw its way back into their minds. Daniel sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Margaret Devereux's grave, where her final wrath had been unleashed. What they had just experienced wasn't something that would easily be forgotten. The image of Margaret, an immensely powerful supernatural force, had appeared before them like a living nightmare. Even though they had managed to push her back, Daniel knew that Margaret's presence had left an indelible mark on them. The graveyard felt haunted, not just by the spirits they had confronted, but by the lingering essence of Margaret's malevolence. Daniel sensed it in the air, as if her curse had seeped into the very soil beneath them, waiting patiently for its moment to return. He understood now that while they had won this battle, the war was far from over. Ryan glanced over at Daniel, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel shook his head slowly, his gaze still locked on the grave. "No," he replied, his voice hoarse. "This darkness, it doesn't just fade away." Both of them knew the truth. The shadow of Margaret Devereux would continue to haunt them, lurking in the corners of their minds, a constant reminder that the darkness they had confronted was never truly gone. Ryan quietly stood up, his gaze fixed on the ground where Alex had been pulled into the earth, gone forever. Everything around them had returned to an eerie calm, but the weight of Alex's loss was unbearable. Guilt gnawed at both of them. They had dragged Alex into this deadly adventure, and now there was no way to bring him back. "We have to leave," Ryan said, his voice raspy from exhaustion and emotion. "Alex is gone, and I don't think we should stay here any longer." Daniel nodded silently. Neither of them wanted to remain in this cursed place for another second. They gathered the remaining items. The glow from the ritual long extinguished, and the darkness crept back, though this time it no longer carried the same menacing presence. But the cemetery still felt haunted by the loss of their friend. Without speaking further, they began to make their way out of Margaret's gravesite, walking toward the cemetery gates. The air, though cold, no longer felt as suffocating, but it was impossible to shake the heaviness in their hearts. As they left the resting place of Margaret Devereux behind, they knew that they were leaving a piece of themselves with her, and the horror they had survived would follow them long after they left Silver Creek. As they made their way out of the cemetery, neither spoke a word. Both were lost in their own thoughts, each footstep echoing in the unnervingly quiet air. The wind still blew softly, but now it carried none of the whispers of lost souls or the terrifying visions they had faced. Silver Creek Cemetery lay silent, almost peaceful, as if it had returned to a slumber once more. As they neared the gate, Daniel paused and turned back for one final look. The sight before him was like a tragic painting. Rows of moss-covered graves, wild grass growing around crumbling headstones, all shrouded in thick fog, creating an indescribable gloom. He knew he would never forget what had happened here, and though they had escaped the nightmare, Daniel understood that these horrific memories would haunt him forever. "Is she really gone?" Ryan asked quietly, his voice soft as they stepped outside the cemetery gates. "Are we sure the curse is over?" Daniel hesitated, glancing back at the eerie graveyard once more before turning to face Ryan. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "I want to believe it is, but something like that, it never truly fades." The two of them continued down the path, leaving Silver Creek behind, but the weight of everything they had endured hung in the air between them. The nightmare might have ended for now, but neither could shake the feeling that Margaret's dark presence was never truly gone. Daniel remained silent for a moment, his thoughts swirling in the depths of his mind. He knew the answer wasn't simple. "I'm not sure," Daniel admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "We performed the ritual and sealed Margaret, but something still lingers. I don't think we'll ever be free of this." Ryan said nothing in response. Together, They walked through the rusted gates of the cemetery and back onto the road leading toward the town. The surroundings slowly became more familiar, the faint glow of distant streetlights offering a brief sense of security. Yet deep inside, both men knew that the darkness still lingered, hiding in the recesses of their minds. It felt as though part of their souls had been left behind at Silver Creek, trapped with Margaret Devereux, forever bound to the cursed place. As they drove away from the cemetery, Daniel stared out the window, trying to shake the horrifying images that haunted him. But just as he began to relax, something caught his eye. Out of the corner of his vision, he saw a faint figure, a tall, thin figure standing by the roadside, with long, tangled hair hanging down. His heart raced. He turned to get a better look, but by the time he did, the figure had vanished, leaving him wondering if the nightmare was truly over, or if it was just beginning again. Daniel jerked around, but the figure had already vanished. He took a deep breath, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. Yet deep down, he knew the truth. Darkness doesn't disappear so easily. This nightmare might have ended for now, but Marguerite, with all her hatred and dark power, was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. As they drove deeper into the night, surrounded by the stillness of the road, Daniel's thoughts swirled. And then, breaking through the silence, a faint, icy whisper echoed in his mind, a familiar voice, dripping with malice. "I will return." The chill ran through Daniel's spine, and in that moment, he knew the battle was far from over. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful night at Silver Creek Cemetery, but for Daniel and Ryan, the fear still clung to them like a shadow. Both tried to resume their normal lives, but the nightmare refused to let go. There was always a lingering sense that Margaret Devereux was still out there, lurking in the darkness of their haunting memories, waiting for the right moment. Ryan was the first to realize they hadn't truly escaped the curse. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard footsteps outside his window. At first, he dismissed it as something ordinary, the sound of wind rustling through the trees or the distant hum of the city at night. But when the sound repeated, again and again, he could no longer ignore it. Ryan rose from his bed, heart pounding, and pulled the curtains aside to peer down at the street. The road was cloaked in shadow, empty and still. But beneath the faint glow of the streetlights, he saw a familiar figure. A woman with long, tangled hair stood motionless, her face tilted up toward his window. Ryan's heart slammed in his chest, and for a fleeting second, he knew it was her, Margaret Devereux. She hadn't been vanquished. She was back. Ryan stumbled backward, terror gripping him. The whisper he had hoped would never come true echoed once more in his mind. "I will return." Ryan stepped back, his breath coming in quick gasps. "It can't be," he muttered, his hands trembling. He glanced out the window again, but the figure had vanished, as if it had never been there. However, from that night on, Ryan began to feel Margaret's presence growing stronger. The familiar sounds of footsteps, sighs, and whispers in the wind became a nightly occurrence. He couldn't escape it, but he didn't dare tell Daniel, unsure whether it was real or merely a psychological torment. Yet deep down, he knew Margaret had not disappeared as they had once believed. Meanwhile, Daniel did his best to push aside any lingering fear. He threw himself into his work, hoping that staying busy would keep his mind off the horrors they had experienced. And for a while, it seemed to work. But the relief was temporary. One night, as Daniel was driving home, he saw a figure standing by the side of the road, the very spot where he had once glimpsed Margaret. His heart skipped a beat, but this time he refused to look away. Determined not to run from his fear, Daniel slowed the car, eyes locked on the shadowy figure. As the car inched closer, the headlights illuminated the figure. Daniel's heart pounded as he strained to see, prepared to confront whatever or whoever it was. But just as he was about to drive away, the car suddenly jerked to a stop. The engine cut off without warning. Daniel tried to restart it, but nothing happened. His tension began to mount, and then he heard it. A faint, deliberate knock on the passenger side window. Daniel slowly turned his head, and his heart nearly stopped. Outside, in the darkness, a pale face stared back at him. Margaret Devereux. Her ghostly white skin and dead, glaring eyes filled with pure malice. It was as though she had risen from the depths of hell to reclaim what was hers. Daniel screamed, recoiling in his seat, but when he blinked, the face was gone. The car's engine mysteriously roared back to life, and without hesitation, Daniel floored the gas pedal, speeding away into the night, too terrified to look back. But he knew. This wasn't just a hallucination. Margaret had returned, and this time, she wasn't going to let them escape. Feeling that he could no longer keep it to himself, Daniel called Ryan, and the two decided to meet again to discuss what had been happening. They met at the old bar, the very place where everything had started, and the atmosphere between them was heavy with unspoken dread. Feeling that he could no longer keep it to himself, Daniel called Ryan, and the two decided to meet again to discuss what had been happening. They met at the old bar, the very place where everything had started, and the atmosphere between them was heavy with unspoken dread. They didn't need to say anything. They both knew that the darkness had truly returned. "I saw her." Ryan was the first to speak, his voice low but filled with anxiety. "I hear her voice, see her shadow in my dreams. And even when I'm awake, I think Margaret has come back." Daniel nodded, his face tense. "I've seen her too. It's not just in my head. She's here, watching us. And I have no idea what we're supposed to do next." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared terror hanging between them. Both of them knew that Margaret Devereux's return was real, and the curse they thought they had defeated had only begun to tighten its grip. They sat in silence, grasping for answers, but finding only despair. The ritual they had performed at Silver Creek should have sealed Margaret away forever, yet somehow her spirit continued to haunt them, stronger and more unpredictable than before. Ryan, who had always been the bold and daring one, for the first time felt the weight of helplessness bearing down on him. "We can't keep running. She won't stop until we're dead." Daniel finished the thought, his voice low and filled with sorrow. "I don't know what else to do. We've tried everything, but Margaret isn't letting go. Maybe she's stronger than we ever imagined." The grim realization settled between them like a heavy fog. No matter how hard they had fought, no matter what they had done to stop her, Margaret Devereux's vengeful spirit wasn't going to rest. They had unleashed something far beyond their control, and now they were paying the ultimate price. Ryan clenched his fists, a flicker of defiance lighting up in his eyes. "No, we've come too far to give up now. If Margaret won't stop, then we'll have to fight her again." Daniel looked at Ryan, feeling a fragile sense of determination rising within him. "We'll have to go back to Silver Creek, but this time, we need help. There's got to be something we missed, something we don't yet understand." There was no other choice. They would have to return to where it all began, the Silver Creek Cemetery, for a final confrontation with Margaret. But this time, they wouldn't just be facing an angry spirit. They would be up against a powerful supernatural entity, thirsting for vengeance. The nightmare wasn't over, and the darkness still watched their every move, ready to pull them into its eternal abyss. Tonight, Daniel and Ryan returned to the place they had sworn never to revisit, Silver Creek Cemetery. The air was thick with darkness, like a dense fog, covering everything in its suffocating grip. It felt as if the cemetery itself had been waiting for their return. This time, they weren't treasure hunters or grave robbers. They were reluctant warriors, about to face a force they could hardly comprehend. They had prepared everything: the final charms, candles, and the items the exorcist had given them. But even with these tools, a rising fear gnawed at their insides. Margaret Devereux was no longer just a trapped soul. She had become something far more powerful. A vengeful entity risen from hell itself. "Are we sure about this?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling as they stepped through the cemetery gates. "If this doesn't work, I don't think we're going to make it out alive." Daniel paused, glancing at Ryan, his own fear mirrored in his friend's eyes. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it's the only chance we have left. We've come this far. If we don't face her now, she'll destroy us anyway." With that, they ventured deeper into the cemetery, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the nightmare. Silver Creek was waiting, and Margaret's wrath loomed over them like a shadow that refused to die. This was their final stand, and they knew that if they failed, they would not leave the cemetery alive. Daniel didn't respond, but he knew the truth. They had no other choice. Margaret had returned to haunt them, and if they didn't stop her now, they would be dragged into death's grip, just as Alex had been. The curse they thought they had broken was far from over. Daniel didn't respond, but he knew the truth. They had no other choice. Margaret had returned to haunt them, and if they didn't stop her now, they would be dragged into death's grip, just as Alex had been. The curse they thought they had broken was far from over. The rows of decaying tombstones and overgrown weeds seemed to shift under the weak glow of their flashlights. But more terrifying than anything they could see was the sensation and undeniable feeling that countless unseen eyes were watching their every move, waiting for them to falter. The cemetery wasn't just a place anymore. It was alive, and Margaret's presence lingered in every shadow, ready to strike. They had to keep moving, but with every step, the weight of their fear pressed down harder, as if the very ground beneath them was pulling them closer to the abyss. As they approached Margaret's grave, the wind suddenly picked up, howling fiercely as if a storm were rising from the depths of the earth. Whispers echoed around them, sometimes near, sometimes far, like the screams of cursed souls begging for release or worse, threatening them. From deep within the cemetery, they could feel a sinister energy growing stronger, closing in on them. Ryan desperately began reciting the incantations the exorcists had taught them. But this time, there was no sign that Margaret's spirit was affected. The wind grew fiercer, and the air around them thickened, as if the very darkness was coming to life. Everything seemed to swell around them, pulling them into a black vortex, a living storm of shadows. The ground beneath them trembled, the tombstones swayed, and the night itself seemed to fold in on them. The full force of Margaret's wrath was upon them, and they were being sucked into a battle far beyond their control. They had no choice but to stand their ground, but with the world twisting into a nightmare around them, it felt as though the very cemetery was rising up to consume them, dragging them into Margaret's domain for one final confrontation. And then, from the center of the grave, Margaret Devereux's spirit emerged. She was no longer the faint apparition they had encountered before. Now, she was a fully formed entity of immense power, brimming with hatred. Her face was twisted and pale, like wax, with eyes burning red like the fires of hell. Every step she took shook the earth, and each word she spoke tore through the air with raw, venomous fury. "Did you think you could escape me?" Margaret hissed, her voice sharp as a blade. "I've waited too long for this day, and you will pay the price in blood." Daniel felt his body freeze, as if some invisible force had wrapped itself around him, squeezing tighter with each passing second. He tried to move, to speak, but nothing responded. The weight of her power was overwhelming, suffocating him. Beside him, Ryan stood paralyzed, his eyes wide with desperation. As Margaret drew closer, her cold, outstretched hand reached for them, her touch promising to drag them into eternal darkness. In that moment, Daniel realized the full extent of her wrath. This wasn't just vengeance. Margaret was prepared to pull them into her world, where death and suffering would be their only companions. Time was running out, and if they didn't act, they would be lost to the abyss forever. But at that moment, Daniel realized there was one thing they hadn't used yet. The final talisman the exorcist had given them before he passed away. It was a charm made from a special wood, enchanted by the oldest rituals. Summoning all his remaining strength, Daniel pulled the talisman from his coat pocket, held it high, and shouted the final incantation, the prayer etched into the charm. A brilliant light erupted from the talisman, tearing through the darkness surrounding them. The beam of light, bright as lightning, shot directly at Margaret's spirit. She screamed in agony, trying to resist, but the power of the charm was too strong. Her form began to disintegrate, breaking apart into pieces of black smoke that vanished into the air. "No!" Margaret roared, but her voice weakened and then faded completely. The darkness that had suffocated them dissolved, and the cemetery returned to its eerie silence. Daniel and Ryan collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, utterly exhausted but knowing they had succeeded. The spirit of Margaret Devereux had been sealed away forever, and this time, nothing could bring her back. Both men stood up, looking around Silver Creek Cemetery one last time. There were no more whispers, no lurking darkness, no horrifying visions. They had survived, but the price had been to Hylix was gone forever, and they would never forget what had happened. "We did it," Ryan whispered, his voice shaky but filled with relief. Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on Margaret's grave, now nothing more than a lifeless stone. "Yes, but we'll carry this burden for the rest of our lives." Silently, the two walked away from the cemetery, knowing that the battle with the darkness had finally ended. But deep down, they both understood that some nightmares never truly disappeared, they only lie dormant, waiting in eternal shadows.